I'm just sort of constantly amazed, surprised, delighted, horrified about about people walking around with huge heavy face tattooing. And if you think about that, Omi was doing it in the 1930s, and a lot of the people we'll move on to next as we talk about an inspiration are actually paying attention to Omi, because photos of him, he was very famous right the way through till the late 1940s. He was performed in circuses all across America. He performed in variety halls in France, and was just very, very visible. Photos of him were published in magazines and circulated in the tattoo community. So Omi is this real kind of like touch point. There are then essentially we're moving into kind of the 50s and 60s, and we're thinking about California as always. A large proportion of this, and a key figure, as we touched upon a bit when we mentioned this in our last episode, is the work of Fakir Musafir.
The modern primitives movement.
Yeah. So Musafir, as you'll hear when Tom edits and puts out Paul's talk on this.
I'm doing it today. Well,
it'll be a good companion piece for this. He grew up in this one of the Dakotas, South Dakota, I think I'm right in saying, and found himself as a young boy drawn particularly to kind of National Geographic magazines, right? To these magazines which had a very kind of late colonial like tone to them, where European photographers, anthropologists would go out into the sort of far-flung corners of the world and take photographs of quote-unquote tribal people who living traditional and indigenous ways, and that it often included tattooing. Roland Loomis, as he was known at the time, he was born in 1930, so he's a sort of teenager during World War II, and he's buying these books and buying these magazines and seeing all of these practices, and he ends up essentially wanting to copy them. And I'm sort of we could spend a whole episode on him, and perhaps we'll do. But as I said, Paul covers his life story in a lot of detail. But essentially, to cut a long story short, over the course of the 1940s and 50s into the 60s, he begins to develop, initially basically on his own, in the sort of privacy of his own garage, these practices, or these series of practices which combine everything from tattooing to piercing to body suspension to what are called sun dances, sort of versions of things taken from Native American rituals, and combines them initially as he sort of reveals himself to the world as this character performer, Fakir Musafir, in the early 70s, as what he calls modern primitivism, right? And so there had been, there'd been other tattoo artists and other tattoo collectors also inspired by those same things before him. Perhaps the most interesting of them, again, someone we're going to talk about on the show at a separate moment in time, is this German guy called Albrecht Becker, who tattooed himself like extensively as a gay man in Berlin, and had some black work Borneo rose designs on his collarbones, and eventually ended up basically tattooing his entire body black. Like tattooing was part of his kind of sexual practice as a sexually submissive gay man. And
it's something as well that I'll come back to later in the episode when we're talking about the revival of this style as well.
Yeah, and Becker's like absolutely amazing. He was like imprisoned by the Nazis, and became this like absolute kind of inspiration to Berlin gay scenes, to the tattoo world, etc. When his work was revealed. He's an incredible artist as well, very interesting photographer. But loads of his tattooing begins as direct appropriation of things that he's seen in magazines of black work, and then becomes much more extensive as time goes on. But we're really, but yeah, Mushafar is, I think, our kind of first key figure here, basically because it's around him that a lot of this stuff is made visible to the world. Eventually through this book, Modern Primitives, which came out in 1989, although in earlier versions as well. And it's also through which a lot of the rhetoric around this became quite ossified in the public imagination. I've written about this a long time ago. I mentioned again on our Samuel Stewart episode that Sammy wrote about this in the early 90s, like very early 90s, just after the book came out, that he found the kind of representation of all of these variety of different practices under the banner of primitive was quite problematic for all kinds of reasons. But, different times. Mushafar didn't tattoo himself. He has this huge back piece done by an artist called Dave Slack. And yeah, I think like it is the coming together of this kind of late hippie, post-hippie California version of cultural, kind of new age stuff, I guess we might call it now, with this kind of personal fascination of Mushafar's with anthropological photography, which starts to kind of bring together, certainly for the Republic audience, this idea of black work, and certainly the publication of Modern Primitives, which came out in 1989, became an enormous influence all around the world for a whole generation of people. The book is super interesting. Again, we haven't got time to go into it in detail, but there's loads of figures in there, many of whom aren't really describable as modern primitives at all. Ed Hardy features, for example, in the book. Lyle Tuttle features in the book. Various other people who aren't, part of this, obviously part of this heading of modern primitives are in the book. Most of the writing about the book actually focuses on Mushafar himself and doesn't really pay attention to the complexity and the interesting kind of diversity that's within.
And I think as well at this time, when you're talking about moving out of the kind of post-hippie era of like the late 60s, early 70s, I would argue, the hippie era ended in 1975 with the withdrawal from Saigon. But you have this growing fascination, and I call this, like a postmodern fascination with the primitive, that like we culturally have conquered the world. Everything has been discovered. And it's this weird Western cultural chauvinism obsession with the primitive as this kind of more authentic way of living. And you see that through, the growth and popularity, partially responsible for the growth of popularity of stuff like National Geographic, that is exposing day-to-day people to these far reaches of the world where people are kind of living out of step with time.
Yeah, and in fact, there's lots of sociology and anthropology on that exact question, that after times of conflict, there is a kind of often an upswing of, beliefs in magic and spiritualism. Like we're even seeing it now post-COVID and post-pandemic with rise of interest in the occult and witches and astrology, and there is a kind of sort of nostalgic yearning for a simpler time, which pre-modern societies get to kind of stand in problematically as avatars for. I mean, the Modern Primitive book came out in 1989, chronicling. It has been called a movement, the Modern Primitives. I've argued that I don't think there really was a movement of Modern Primitives. I think there was a few people that Fakir Mushafar knew, who self-identified as modern primitives, but then there were a lot of people who found the stuff interesting and copied it and remixed it in the following decades, but who wouldn't really be either describe themselves or be described as modern primitives. And there's lots of people in the book, as I said, who don't fit into that gap. So, but on that note, I mean, so that's came out in 1989, and Mushafar had been doing this stuff privately through the 40s and 50s and 60s, and revealed himself to the world as Fakir Mushafar in the 70s. But earlier than that, there were, again, tattooers who were starting to draw upon these styles. The most interesting of which is someone who we've also talked about a lot, Cliff Raven, old Chuck Ingram, taught by Sammy Stewart, Cliff actually says in an article that he wrote back in 1981, something that I think probably resonates with what you're saying. With Western civilization crumbling down around our ears, what could be so bad about putting on a little war paint? Right?
And it's also this idea. This is Tom's sociocultural corner. Is that like this idea that civilization as we think of it doesn't really exist? That it is something that is constantly in decay and never in growth. It's like there is always like, you know, civilization as we know it will never provide enough like kind of substantive reason for existence, so you have to like grasp at other things. So it's like, oh well, like these people in, you know, the jungles of Borneo, they have it figured out.